Thank you so much to Ariel, who's been my incredible partner in the last 3 months. We've done a lot of back and forth, and also to all of you for coming. I've given a lot of these talks in the last 5 months, and probably of all the audiences, this is probably the audience that most understands what Jane Jacobs did for the world and for cities. And so it's really fun to be talking to people who really understand. I was giving a talk in West Virginia, in a rural place in West Virginia, and I realized they've probably never been to Greenwich Village or New York City. They have no idea what I'm talking about, so this is really fun. I'm going to start, I usually speak a bit and then read. I'm going to start by reading a little moment from Jane Jacobs, just because she's the patron saint of Greenwich Village, as we know. And she saved the West Village from being knocked down. Her first work was advocating, was working with the community to foil Moses, who wanted to put a 4-lane highway through Washington Square Park, which is so unthinkable because there was no green space downtown. And then, of course, later she started fighting against the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have decimated Soho, Little Italy, Chinatown, and all those wonderful cast iron buildings. So she is our hero. So this is just to get in the mood, and then I'll speak. This is the moment when Jane has been working on her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, for 2 years. She's been walking every neighborhood, and it's finally done. She's passed it into her editors. It felt good to decompress. Now, with the manuscript in her editor's hands, Jane could allow herself the luxury of sleeping in on occasion. It was a bitter February, snowy and raw. She was glad she still had a little time before her scheduled return to Architectural Forum. Glad to be indoors, cozy in her own home, reading at her kitchen table. Normally, she got down to work right away, but on this particular morning, feeling lazy, she let herself linger a bit longer over the New York Times, which was when she saw it, buried at the back of the paper. 2 blighted downtown areas are chosen for urban renewal. Jacob stopped and read the headline again, squinting this time in the accompanying map. One of the 2 blighted areas was on the Lower East Side near Tompkins Square Park. The other spanned 14 blocks of the West Village, including, she now saw, her own. She frowned and read on. The area where she lived was described by the city as a rundown industrial zone with beat-up tenement buildings housing at best 600 families. The implication seemed to be that such an insignificant number of households could be easy to relocate. Before moving forward, the article said the city would spend $350,000 to conduct a study to determine if the 2 neighborhoods were eligible for urban renewal. Jacob stared at the article in disbelief. Her house in her friendly, easygoing neighborhood, the lively place she had just described so glowingly in her book, now stood to be destroyed by the same inane anti-city forces she spent the last 2 years picking apart. She studied the map again. It was an affront to everything she knew about cities, everything she loved about her neighborhood, about as neat a case study, she said, the intellectual idiocies driving urban renewal policies these days. It was also underhanded. To characterize what was going on as a routine study was disingenuous, deeply cynical on the city's part. From all the reporting she'd done, she knew that the outcome was already a foregone conclusion. These studies always ended with a blight designation. She could even guess at the scope of the project. The money granted for the study was always a given percentage of the cost of the whole project. The price tag for this study was just what you'd expect for wiping out 14 blocks and putting in high-rise apartments. Okay, so that's Jane. So this book, as probably all of you know, there's actually someone in the audience who knew Jane and who's going to tell us a few stories at the end. But all of these women were incredibly good communicators, and I thought before I start talking about Carson and Jacobs, I'll tell you another little story. I was recently in LA at a book festival, and I was on a panel called Writing Great Lives, and it was about it was 4 biographers. And we were all talking about the stories that ended up on the cutting room floor that didn't make it into the book. And because I was writing about 4 women, and I had to kind of channel, first of all, internalize 4 different lives and then channel them and then write them, there was a lot that ended up on the cutting floor. So my story of what didn't make it into the book was from Jane Goodall, who was the first to see chimps using tools, which changed our idea about animals. Anyway, Jane travels 300 days a year, still to this day. She's 84. And she was told, and she has 2 or 3 handlers, and she was told at the last minute that she was supposed to go and speak before a group of the LA police brass. And she thought, oh my God, what are we going to speak to them about? So she walked into the room, and there were all these policemen, all looking at their laps, you know, clearly thinking, why do we have to be here listening to this female primatologist? So she looked around and she said, well, if I was a female chimp and I was going to walk into a room such as this, filled with alpha males, I would be an idiot if I didn't start with a gesture of submission, which would be to show my genitals. At which point everyone perked right up and paid attention. And I can say that Jacobs also, I don't know how many of you know the stories, but Jacobs also knew how to get people's attention. When she was fighting Robert Moses, who was trying to take down, as I said, 14 blocks of the West Village, she was ingenious about getting good press coverage. And at one point when she organized the neighborhood to go to, I think it was the planning board, she bought everyone sunglasses, and she put masking tape X's on both lenses, because the X was what the city used for condemned buildings. And whenever they decided that a neighborhood was slated for urban renewal, they put X's on everyone's door. So, you know, 200 people showed up with these sunglasses with X's, which immediately was picked up not only by all the New York papers, but national papers, completely changing the narrative. So she was also, like Goodall, very good at capturing attention. So tonight, I mean, one of the things that people ask me always is, why did you choose these 4 women? And my answer always is, this book began with a conversation with a friend of mine, and I realized there were 4 really great women who changed the way we think about a swath of the world. Rachel Carson, who at age 55 in 1962 wrote Silent Spring, which changed the way we think about chemicals in the environment and started the environmental movement. Jane Jacobs, who saved the village, and in her 40s when she wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which completely changed the way the world thinks about cities and older buildings and older neighborhoods, and completely was a paradigm change. Jane Goodall, who discovered chimps using tools in 1961 and changed the way we think about animals, and Alice Waters, who had her epiphanies about food and friends in 1965 on a semester abroad, came back to the United States, came back to Berkeley, and started Chez Panisse, which was the beginning of the sustainable food movement. So that really interested me. So I thought, well, maybe this is a book. So I started to read, and I started to read all of Carson's books and all of Jacob's books. And I began to see there were there was a lot of common ground. Both women were outsiders, uncredentialed outsiders. Jacobs never even went to college. She was a terrible student. She never studied architecture or planning. She talked her way into her job at Architectural Forum. Basically went there and said, I need to speak to the editor-in-chief. and basically, you know, he said, well, okay, do an article, do a sample article, we'll see. And she wrote just this very lively, interesting, colorful article, and he said, okay, you're hired. You will be our school and hospital reporter. So this was pure chutzpah on her part. All of them, well, both of them were conservationists, green thinkers before the idea of green or ecology was even in our collective vocabulary. Both of them spoke truth to power. They waded into their fields without any theory, without any training, and against all odds prevailed, even though Carson had the entire chemical industry arrayed around her. They circled the wagons and mounted a major smear campaign after Silent Spring was published. Jacobs encountered the same. She was decried as a sentimental housefrau, as a wacky bohemian, as an amateur, as someone who didn't have any training, and really disparaged. And they, against even with so much marginalization, they didn't back down, which is really interesting. Both of them wrote iconic books that started sweeping social movements, and both of them had their breakthrough moments in the early 60s, which really interested me. Jacob's book was 61 and Carson's 62. So originally I thought, okay, the 60s is my fifth character. But as I began reading, I realized it was really the 50s that was my fifth character, because it was the values and priorities of the 50s that both of those women were pushing back against. Particularly the country's infatuation with technology, its deference to big business, and its increasing disconnection from nature. So let's talk a little about the 50s, just because it's the context of their incredible work. The 50s was characterized by intense conformity and Cold War fears. The economy was booming, the culture was awash in all of these consumer goods, and yet everyone was paranoid about nuclear Armageddon. There had been nuclear testing all through the 50s. The great legislative monument of the era was the interstate highway system. And its justification was to whiz the new class of businessmen from the newly minted suburbs to the city, but also more gravely to move nuclear weapons around between cities and country if nuclear war broke out. So it was also a strategic initiative. The bomb had won the war, and so physicists and chemists were king. And it was during the war that chemicals like DDT were invented. At the time, DDT seemed like an enormous panacea. It killed lice for soldiers in the trenches. It killed insects that carried diseases like typhus and cholera. And so there was sort of no question that this was a good thing, and that chemists would come up with this, would be able to change the world. DDT is very much like sarin, the nerve gas sarin, and after the war there was a surfeit of product, and the chemicals companies thought, let's turn this into domestic use, and so was born the pesticide industry. There were no tests yet on really what the long-term consequences of pesticides on the environment were, and there were no tests on how they affected humans. Rachel Carson, it should be also added at that moment, even though women had a lot of jobs, important jobs during the war, during the 50s, they were told to go back home and to be consumers, be good consumers, buy washing machines and refrigerators, and their jobs were given back to the GIs returning home. So the question, what was it? Oh, I should also say that if only 6% of women were lawyers or doctors, if you were a scientist, as Carson was, you could teach or you could edit other scientists, or scientists who went into the fields. You could edit the reports, but you were never sent into the fields. Most women were secretaries. Jane Jacobs had taken a secretarial course before she got to New York City, and her idea was she would support herself. Until she got a writing job, she would support herself as a secretary, which is what she did for quite a few years. So the question, what was it about these two women who, at a time when women couldn't serve on jury duty in many states, they couldn't get a credit card or credit without a male cosigner. If they owned property, as soon as they were married, it was their husband's property. What was it about two women at a time when they had so few rights and no voice that allowed these women to have such an impact? And part of it has to do with the 60s. There was a real break from, a cultural break from what had come before. But part of it had to do with the fact that because they were outsiders and because they were untrained, they had a completely different approach to their work. They were both keenly observant. They waded into their respective fields and looked very carefully at what they saw. Most of us go into the world with a certain kind of confirmation bias. we think we know what we believe, and then we gather data based upon what we believe. And Jacob said, I don't really know what I think. I go into the world and I start looking carefully for patterns. And when I begin to see patterns, I begin then to generalize and I see what I think. So already there was a real difference in the way they were looking at things. Carson had, I'm just going to get water here. Should also say both of them were highly intuitive. They trusted their senses, they trusted their intuition. They went into the world and they not with received information, but with the wisdom of direct engagement. At the time, the culture was in the thrall of theory and expertise, and of course they had neither of those things. The way architecture was being treated was highly theoretical. All planners and architects were in the thrall of the modernist canon. Decisions were being made based upon statistics, traffic engineers. They were deciding what parts of the city to take down based upon flow charts, but none of it was hands-on in the world. Zoology was the same, was number-oriented too, was highly theoretical. It involved shooting wild animals and measuring their remains, counting their teeth. It was really treated as if it was mathematics. These women, the only thing measurable really was what could be quantified. And these women went into their work with a very different orientation. Carson had, I'll tell you just a little about Carson, because Carson was really was the first person to see the connectivity of the living world. Carson had grown up in Pennsylvania, landlocked, and grew up in a very, very poor family. Her father was a kind of ne'er-do-well. He was a traveling salesman. Most of the time he had no job. Her mother sometimes gave piano lessons, but basically just tried to hold the family together. Rachel was quite smart, and so she got a scholarship to college. And when she got to college, she thought she was going to be a writer, and then she took a biology course. And it was a very charismatic biology teacher who kind of turned her head around, and she realized that she was fascinated by science. This professor ended up getting her a fellowship at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And Rachel had always had a fantasy about the seas, so she got to Woods Hole, and she started walking the beach and staring into tide pools and wading into the water and looking at everything she saw, and she became fascinated by the world of the sea. And that was where her first writing began. When she graduated from college, she got a job with the Fish and Wildlife Service writing little shorts for 2 days a week, and the rest of the time, she was supporting her entire family at the time. The rest of the time, she started trying to write freelance articles, and they were freelance articles about the sea. And even in those early years, one of the things she realized is most nature writers cataloged the things of the world in sort of separate compartments. And when she would stare for hours at a tide pool, she saw that actually everything was connected to everything else. And there was no way to understand a mussel or a starfish or any creature without understanding its environment, without understanding what it ate, what ate it. And that there was no way to look or understand at the natural world without seeing the larger system. So, which is really an ecological way of looking at things. So her early writing was really all about, was really different already. It was about this kind of connectedness. This really came into play with Silent Spring because at the time, no one really knew what pesticides did. Everyone, if they were like my father, he never met a pesticide he didn't adore, or bug spray. And what she showed was that you couldn't pour poison into one place without it flowing into another, that nature did not operate in separate compartments, and that DDT at the time was being sprayed over entire states, sometimes 3-state campaigns, and that it didn't just kill bugs, but it poisoned fish and birds, and eventually worked its way up the food chain to humans, which was, again, this idea that the living world was connected, and that you couldn't expect that poisons would stay one place. So Jacobs, who's of course writing about something completely different from Carson, didn't know anything about, well, she probably actually had read, I've gotten to know her son a little bit, she probably had read Rachel Carson. Silent Spring hadn't come out yet when Jacobs started to work about cities. But her first job for Architectural Forum, she was sent out to report on a new thing called urban renewal. And they were, in Philadelphia, there were large projects, they were demolishing huge swaths of neighborhood and then putting up high-rise housing towers that were surrounded by grass or open plazas. And Jacobs had no real opinion about urban renewal. It was a new thing Moses was doing it in New York, particularly uptown. And so she was sent to Philadelphia, and she was met by the planner there, who was named Ed Bacon. And he said, first we're going to go to the neighborhood that we're getting rid of, the problem, and then we'll go to what we're doing, we'll show you what we're doing. So they went to one of the old Philadelphia neighborhoods, and what Jacob saw were all these people popping in and out of stores and talking to each other in the street and fraternizing, and the sidewalk was really crowded. And he said, this is what we've got to get rid of. And so then he walked her over to one of the projects. And he, sort of said, what up? And she looked, and there were these really monotonous looking housing towers, and there was no one in sight, no people. And she said, where are the people? And he said, oh, this is, they don't appreciate the order of this, the architect, the geometry. And she thought, there's something wrong with this picture. The human quotient has been lost. So she went back to Architectural Forum, and she said to her colleagues, it's not working. This idea of urban renewal, what I just saw, is not working. And they said, you can't write that. Robert Moses is saving cities. At that time, there was the feeling that cities were going down the tubes. And probably all of us here remember New York was on the brink of bankruptcy. Everyone thought it was big, cities were going to be lost. And so the idea with urban renewal was that the way to revive cities would be to take down, with large-scale interventions, take down whole neighborhoods and rebuild, and often rebuild with high-rise towers. And she said, I've just seen it, it's not working. So she wrote the article, and the article got a huge amount of attention. People were really relieved that finally someone had said, the emperor has no clothes. This idea of revitalization is really deadening cities. So from there, she was then asked to do another article, similar article for Fortune magazine, and that garnered even more interest, and that led to a book contract. And so she started doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was to walk the blocks of New York City, every block, every neighborhood, and talk to people and try to figure out what made cities work, why some blocks felt menacing, while others felt lively, how parks worked, why some were scabby with disuse and others were filled with people, what the role of the sidewalk. And she was looking really carefully. And what she ended up, one day she was in Harlem, and it was again an old neighborhood, really busy neighborhood, and there were all these people on the street, and there were some TVs on the sidewalk, which had been hot wired to a telephone pole, and all these people were gathered. And she had this epiphany, and she realized cities have an ecology too, but it's a human ecology. And it's the people that are like the oysters in the oyster beds. And that if you knock down a big swath of the city, you knock out the street life. The street life is the connective tissue that knit together the urban grid, and it allowed one neighborhood to flow into the next, and it gave it its liveliness and cheer. And then if you got rid of street life, you lost the city. So she was really looking at things in the same way Carson was. She was seeing the city as an ecology. She was seeing that the city was actually an enormous web of relationships, a system of intricate interdependencies, and that if you destroyed that, there was a fragility to that, and you could kill a city. And it was the same thing that Carson was saying about the natural world when she was writing about DDT and other pesticides, that if you killed one bug, or you might think it didn't matter, but in fact that bug was maybe the one food for a fish, and that fish was the food for a bird, and that bird was the one bird that carried a certain seed, and the plant that seed grew out of fed another animal, and then it was all a web of interconnections. So they were thinking along the same lines, even though they were writing about two very, very different worlds. the other thing that, well, there were so many other things that were similar in terms of their thinking. Jacobs recognized right away that diversity in a neighborhood was hugely important. And it wasn't just black and white, Hispanic, it was about diversity of uses, that a neighborhood that was thriving needed lots of different people doing different things. A hardware store and a butcher and a baker and you know, a appliance, someone was fixing appliances. All people in a neighborhood for many different reasons at many different times. And then a monoculture, like Soho is today, which is only one thing, either big box stores or designer, you know, shops. There's only one kind of person then who is on the street to go to those places, and at night it's a completely dead place. And what she realized in Greenwich Village, in her own neighborhood in the West Village, was there were always eyes on the street. There were always people on the street for different reasons. There were longshoremen at night, and there were school children in the day with their families. There was always a changing guard of people. And this kind of diversity is the same kind of diversity that Carson was talking about in wetlands. That you need that kind of diversity to feed the whole system. The other thing that they had in common was Jacobs said cities were never finished, and that the whole idea of kind of doing something and it coming to some kind of closure wasn't the way cities works. That cities were constantly evolving and readjusting and readapting, and you needed the feedback loop of what worked and what didn't, and there were things would be repurposed, as we saw in Soho, which was a neighborhood that was all abandoned warehouses that had housed little companies. And instead of knocking it down, which is what Moses would have done and other city planners, Jacobs said, you know, these buildings become other things in another era, and which was true. You know, stables became theaters. Small factories became artist lofts, and then eventually other things. So they were both talking always about the fact that a natural system and the ecosystem of urbanity were very similar, that they were always evolving, and that you couldn't really bracket anything. The other thing was that, you know, when you think about Grand Central and it's during rush hour, and you walk through it, and there are tons of people streaming in every direction, no one bumps into anyone else. And this was something that Jacobs said, this is a kind of swarm intelligence. It's the same intelligence as starlings and schools of fish. You know, they somehow know where everyone else is, and they avoid their own patterns. And we all kind of know that intuitively, but she was the one who was able to sort of identify it. And again, so much like Carson, who'd been staring up at flocks of birds and schools of fish most of her life. What was interesting about both of them is that the men who had made the world of the 50s saw separations, and these women were seeing unities and connections. They were seeing the world as a holistic system, which is a really new way of thinking. Actually, the other two women too. And it was arguably a way of thinking with a longer timeline. This kind of short-term corporate military thinking was always top-down, growth for the next quarter, solve the immediate problem. These women were both looking at the long term, what was sustainable in the long term, what sustained cities, which was healthy, local neighborhoods, and that change came from the bottom up. And the top-down change often was artificial change, and it wasn't sustainable. And that what we needed to do was to study natural systems, which Jacobs contended the city was, and try to mirror that, and try to mimic it, and try to enhance that. There's a woman, a younger woman, who's sort of picked up on Jacobs' ideas, called Janine Benyus, and she has become sort of a hero to the environmental movement, because she contends that engineers and software makers and people who are trying to solve problems in the world need to look at natural systems and to mimic them. And things like burdock is Velcro. You know, the little. There's so many things like that are, if you look carefully at nature, those kinds of questions are solved. Both of these women already were doing that, and inadvertently. That was just their nature. The other thing is that at the time, because life is so theoretical, there were not only was there a sense that only experts could weigh in on things, but there was a lot of jargon and dry jargon. Both women wrote anecdotally. They wrote about what they saw. They wrote about their experiences. They were unafraid to talk about, using the I, and rather than pretending to be objective, they talked about what they saw, and that humanized very complicated questions that the country was facing. And it put a personal face on these kinds of questions. And that was something new. And they were really criticized for that, for being anecdotal and for not speaking jargon and not using scientific terms. But it was also what made them accessible. I mean, no one would read about urban planning, before Jacobs. And she made it require reading. It was so lively. And anyone who's ever read The Death and Life of Great American Cities, it's funny and smart and filled with anecdotes and filled with things she's seen out of her window. And so that was one of the ways they reached people at a time when only experts were listened to. The other thing is that they were very, very positive. They were talking about the things they wanted to save, not the things they wanted to kill. And the culture of the 50s was all about killing, bugs, getting rid of old parts of cities, destroying things rather than trying to preserve what was working and understanding why. I think that's that's the essence of it. The other thing I want to say is that, and I'm going to read this because Wendell Berry, who is a poet farmer, talks about the world as being divided into exploiters and nurturers. And both of these women were nurturers, they were not exploiters. And this is what he says. He says, the goal of the exploiter is efficiency, the goal of the nurturer is care. The goal of the exploiter is money, profit. For the nurturer, it's health, land, family, community, place. The exploiter thinks in terms of numbers, quantities, hard facts. The nurturer thinks about character, quality. These women were both nurturers, which is arguably a maternal instinct, but it doesn't. Men are nurturers too. But they were able to tap into something in the culture where people wanted the world to be, again, more human-scaled, and to be the world to be more humane, and that the public good was more important than growth for the next quarter. I can say many, many more things, but maybe I should stop there, and people can ask questions and yes?
Well, I have a statement to make about Jane Jacobs, because I knew...
This is by the gentleman who knew Jacobs.
Shall I speak from here?
Yes.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I think I'll just step on the side of the acoustics seem very well. My name is Michael Levine. I have just concluded 50 years as a professional city planner, 30 years for the City Planning Commission, 10 years for the American Planning Association, and 10 years for the Lambda Community Board, and I am now officially retired. I say that as an introduction, not as an advertisement for myself, because in my semi-retirement, I am teaching undergraduate urban planning to students at Police University. And the reason for my remarks are that I came in contact with Jane Jacobs several times when she was here in New York City way back in the 1960s. I came in contact with Jane the very first time in 1967, just before she left for Toronto. I met her at a community board meeting, and I went to Jane Jacobs and I said to her, after I was introduced properly by the community board chairperson, I'm a student at Hunter College. I'm pursuing a degree in urban planning. She had no idea that there were degrees in urban planning, that there was a professional master's degree. And I said, I think you'll be pleased to know that your book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is required reading for every student in our program. We only had 60 people in the program then. And she stared at me straight in the eyes and she said, well, that's nice to hear. You go back to your school and you tell your fellow students that this book is the only book they ever need to read. Disregard everything else you've been told to read. My book is all you ever need to know about city planning. And I said, okay, this is a very opinionated, brash woman. And when I went back to school, I think I was afraid to mention it to any of my students, that she really, really felt that hers was the only book. A lot of us felt that way too. The second time I came in contact with her again, just before she left, was I had mentioned to her when I spoke to her, did you really observe everything from the window of your apartment out onto the street that you talked about in the book? Did you really watch your children going to and from school? And she said, if you don't believe me, come up to my apartment and I'll show you. And I said, wow, I'm going to see Jane Jacobs' window, eyes on the street. And when I got up there, she took me to the window and she said, look down, what do you see? And I said, you're right. I see people on the sidewalk.
Does everyone know about Eyes on the Street?
It's in her chapter, Sidewalks Are for Safety. Yeah,
for those of you who don't know, she said that one night she was working on her book. She was working on it for about 2 years, and it was a sort of frustrating night. And she heard, it was dark, and she heard a bagpipe. And she lifted the blind, and she saw a bagpiper who was standing there alone. And then suddenly a crowd started to gather around the bagpiper. And then people across the street and on her block all started to raise their windows to listen to the bagpiper. And she had this, again, epiphany at the moment, because she realized that everyone, and so the bagpiper was going, and then a few people started doing a little Scottish jig to the bagpiper. And so there's a little dance, impromptu dance, and he stopped, and then the crowd dispersed, and it was quiet again. And she realized in that moment that everyone had felt safe at that moment. And even though they were strangers, they'd never seen each other, no one felt threatened. It was a dark night because there were eyes on the street. All the people in the neighborhood looking out, but people looking for each other. And it really became an important part of her book. She talked about the importance of eyes on the street, and that neighborhoods that didn't have eyes on the street, where they were too anonymous, and people didn't know each other, they didn't know their neighbors, they didn't know their shopkeepers, they were less safe, which makes perfect sense. And she had other examples. One day she was looking out her window and she saw a little girl kind of stiffening, and there was a man who seemed to be luring the girl away. And she said as she thought, or maybe I'm going to have to intervene. And as she was watching, she saw the butcher come into his doorway and stand like that, and then another shopkeeper to kind of go. And she realized no one was going to be able to drag away this little child, because there were so many people there who would intervene right away, and that was Eyes on the Street. So it's something that's used now in policing in every city, because if you have enough people on the street, you have people walking the street, it's much safer than, we all know not to walk on an empty block. That's what's menacing. So she, again, that's so much her intuition to put that together.
And what she said to me at that time, you look out of this window, and she was still preaching, very much in that mode. She was always preaching. She never stopped, because she believed so strongly in everything she said in her book. That's what's wrong with the projects. She meant public housing. And that's what's wrong with urban renewal. If you look out of a window from one of those high-rise towers, a mother cannot see her child.
Yeah.
And those sidewalks are not safe. And I said, thank you. I had to agree with her at that point. And of course, that's what the book is all about. My third real quick story about her is she came back to Greenwich Village in the 1970s and addressed a special meeting of the Greenwich Village Community Board number 2 at PS 41 here on 11th Street. And she spoke to us about her impressions coming back to New York City. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, she only came back once.
No, she came back more.
She did come back more?
Yeah, because she was often invited to speak.
To speak?
Yeah.
But at that time, I think it was the first time
that could be
that she had come back since she had gone to Toronto. And when we kind of asked her, well, what's your impression about what's happening in New York? And you were right, it was financial times were not very good. And she said, I don't like what I see. I'm seeing high-rise housing going up in places that is still incorrect. This is not the way to reclaim cities. We need to revive existing neighborhoods. We need to leave the fabric that's there already and make it better, not replace it. Now, here's my question to you and to the audience. And I have the answer, but I'm going to get to it.
She wouldn't like that. You're supposed to look for patterns.
But she would like the answer. Is Jane Jacobs still relevant for urban planning students today?
Absolutely.
Of course the answer is yes. When I explain to my undergraduate students who are 17, 18, and 19 who never heard of her, why am I assigning a book written not by a professional planner, but by a housewife from Greenwich Village as required reading in this class, I explain to them, this woman is now required reading in every urban planning school across the nation. When I attended a planning conference in Chicago in the 50th anniversary in 2011, there was a panel discussion, and the directors of all the planning schools across the nation, Berkeley, Columbia, Pratt, every planning school, were told to put together a list of the 10 required readings for the graduate urban planning students, and the moderator of the panel said, there's one and only one book that shows up on every single list.
Yeah, that's true.
Jane
Yeah,
Jacobs,
that's
Death
true.
and Life of
And still is. She's also celebrated in Europe. She's in France. She's thought of as a philosopher. In Japan, she's thought of as an economist. She, said cities were economic engines. That cities, again, like a wetlands, were places where lots of ideas would combine, and out of those ideas would come new work and new businesses. And it didn't come from the sticks that came from cities, and that's why cities were really important to protect. And that human scale was all about human relationships. I had gotten to know her son a bit, and he told, do you think I can tell this story about he told sort of an amazing story when she was fighting, I'll share it, when she was fighting the Lower Manhattan Expressway, Lomex, and she had noticed that in all the meetings, because Lomex was going to go along Broome Street, was going to connect the Holland Tunnel to the Manhattan, and it was going to wipe out easily 3 or 4 blocks on either side of Soho, and it was going to amputate all of Lower Manhattan because no one walks under a highway. And so she said that she noticed in all the meetings for Lomex, the pro and con, that there were always a lot of mafia guys at the meetings because they were in the road building and cement business, and it was more work for them. Yeah.
But he specifically said that there were always people in hard hats.
Right.
In the meetings.
Right.
And they all wore their hard hats.
Right. They wore their hard hats. They were members of the mafia. So Jane remembered, because Jane was so much about connecting with people. She remembered when she grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, she had a friend whose father was in the mafia, and she thought, I'm going to call my friend, she's still in touch with her, see if she can set up a meeting with one of the bosses in New York Mafia. So her friend said, yeah, I'll ask my father, and he did, and he set up a meeting for Jane and her friend, and they went and met with Mafia boss. And they were, in their little pocketbooks and their little little dresses. And so Jane said, we've noticed there are always a lot of your guys at the meetings, and this is why we want to save our neighborhood, and you guys can build roads and put down cement anywhere. Why are you going to go through your own neighborhood, Little Italy, and through our neighborhood? And they just she really just talked, and he nodded, and he said, I'll take what you say into consideration. And from then on, there were no hard-hatted mafia guys at the pro against Lomex. So she'd been effective, and that's the kind of thing that she was so savvy about, because she realized if the fix is in, you've got to figure out who the people are you need to talk to, even if it's unsavory. And she understood. She was really pragmatic about how you had to strategize, and that maybe one-to-one you can make a case, and so she did. That story has never been written, and I love it because it's so Jane Jacobs. Other questions? Yeah?
Yeah, hi. A question about Rachel Carson, but first a comment about Jane Jacobs and urban planning. I went to City College Architecture in the 60s, and we were required to read Jane's book.
It's great.
And the attitude then was the architect was the all-around, former of these things. In fact, the word architect has entered the lexicon of the language. Kissinger was the architect of the agreement.
Right.
So, but I had one professor who was very pro-architect and this holistic view. He said, if you can draw and you can design, you may can draw, but you can't design, become an interior decorator. And if you can't draw and you can't design, become an urban planner.
Oh, funny.
So you learn the whole idea of urban planning with high rises, open land, was out of the Harvard Design
Yes,
School.
out of modernism and Gropius and, yeah.
Gropius' idea was one thing. They took it and they messed it up.
Right,
Because they finally figured out that if you're putting up a project, high rises, yes, you couldn't see, you know, from your 5th to 6th story window, and they were putting these concrete walks, and no one used them.
right.
What they
There was
did
no
was
reason, because
they
there's,
did it last. They watched where the people formed the natural paths.
yeah,
Once they were formed,
yeah.
they paved them over.
Yeah, one of the things Jacobs saw was that one cavernous supermarket on the ground floor of a housing tower was not the same as the 40 individual stores on a block, on an old block. That people didn't want to go, they didn't stop and talk to each other at the cavernous store if they went there at all. They'd go to more intimate neighborhoods. And yeah, there was no planning for people. There was planning for the way things looked and the symmetry and for living quarters, but not for the kind of casual, intimate spots that really make up a city. We all know the way in New York you can run into a friend you haven't seen or talked to in 6 months, and you can have a great little conversation on the street, and you leave feeling so great, and you think, how great, we didn't have to set up a coffee, dinner party. We just ran into each other, and that's what makes cities tick, and that's what makes, you know, people collaborate. And Jane recognized the human side of things. And I think the planners were so steeped in theory, which was elegant, intellectually elegant, but which kind of left out the human quotient, and certainly missed a lot of times human scale. Yeah,
My
go on.
question about Rachel, did she know about or was in contact with, or maybe the other way around? Because one of the books that I found fascinating was Annie Diller's book, Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek.
Yeah, that's much later. That's
Well,
much
it was
later.
67 when the article came out.
It's
in
a
Harper's,
beautiful book, by the way.
and,
Yeah.
in fact, the chapter was on the birth of, observation of the birth of a praying mantis nest. And I came up with the word, she introduced me to the word fecundity.
Mm.
It's a great word.
That's a great, Annie Diller's book is
Yeah.
great, but that would have been
But
later.
I'm saying, maybe was Annie Dillard aware, or would they
You know what, I bet
communicate
Annie
more?
Dillard was aware of Carson. Carson, I don't know whether everyone knows this, but when Carson was writing Silent Spring, she'd been diagnosed with breast cancer. She'd had a radical mastectomy. She hadn't been told when she had her first operation that it had metastasized, and she didn't want anyone to know about it because she was afraid the chemical companies would say, well, the only reason this woman is interested in pesticides and the association between pesticides and cancer is because she's dying of cancer. So all the time she was writing, she kept that hidden, and she died very soon after Silent Spring came out. She testified before Congress, I think it was in 1963, and from that testimony, the EPA was started. And she did a CBS News program where she spoke about pesticides. She was interviewed by Eric Severod, and then she died really soon after. So she would have been dead by the time Annie wrote that, but I bet you anything you're right, that Annie Dillard would have read not only Silent Spring, but some of Rachel's books about the sea. She was really a best-selling author about the sea, which is one of the reasons she had such a huge audience when Silent Spring came out. She didn't even want to write. She wasn't a polemical writer before that. She didn't even want to write Silent Spring, but what happened was someone had written her and said, you know, there's a 3-state spray campaign of DDT in Maine and Massachusetts and Connecticut, and a lot of people are feeling it's unfair that DDT is raining down on their vegetable gardens, really think there's going to be a lawsuit, I think you should write about it. So she wrote to the New Yorker and said, she wrote to E.B. White and said, someone should cover this for the New Yorker, this is really a big story. And E.B. White said, it's a really important story, but I'm busy, why don't you do it? So that's how she got going on Silent Spring. And then she was diagnosed with cancer, and then the more research she did, the more urgent she became about getting out the information, because she understood the science, and she wrote it in layman's language so that all of us could understand it, which is a really hard thing to do. And so it's really a beautiful book, and it isn't even a long book, and it was such bad news, but her writing was so lyrical that she was able to couch it, and then she died, very abruptly. And this is another little interesting aside. At the time she was writing the sea book, she had already noticed that seas were rising, seas were getting warmer. So she had already identified the fact that global warming was occurring. And this is in the early 60s. And it makes you wonder, had she lived, it might have been another book that she did. And at the point when Silent Spring came out, she was the most best-selling author in the world. I mean, her books were published in 14 languages. She continued to be on the bestseller list for I think a year and a half. And so she had the kind of authority no scientist today has, and the environment wasn't yet a partisan issue. It wasn't Democrat or Republican. And you wonder if she had lived, because she was only 54 or 5 when she died, it would be a different scenario now, because she was greatly respected, and she could write about those things in a way that made people understand and care. And the EPA and then the Clean Water Act, all those things grew out of Silent Spring and her work. Any other questions? Yeah?
Not a question, but everyone should be aware of a petition that's online right now about Jane Goodall, asking the Nobel Peace Prize Commission to consider her, because it's not a prize that can be given after someone dies.
Right.
She is still alive, so she should be considered. So just Google, Jane Goodall, change.org, and sign the petition if you would.
That's a great thing to know. I mean, she's really a hero, and she's still, literally, she's still on the road 300 days a year, advocating for animals, for sustainable habitats, talking to timber company executives about not deforesting the Amazon. I mean, she's incredible. Yeah?
Just curiosity, what street did she live on?
She lived on Hudson Street, and actually one of the first things I did was to go and see her house. This is another thing, is that she and Bob, who was her husband, who was an architect and who was really supportive of her, got a derelict building on Hudson Street, and I've now forgotten the number, but it's a 555, thank you. And in those days, no one was doing urban gentrification, so they fixed the house up themselves. They paid exactly the same price it would cost to get a house in Levittown. And they were, determined. They had 3 kids. She baked and prepared for the holidays. She was very much a housewife as well as a career woman. And they were determined that it was more interesting for their kids to grow up in the city. And so they fixed that up. And really, she would have stayed probably. She was tired of fighting City Hall, but they were also all against the Vietnam War, and her sons were just getting to be the age where they would have been drafted. So between fighting City Hall and then fighting, being drafted, they decided to move to Canada. And she immediately was conscripted into a fight against a highway as soon as she got to Toronto. Everyone knew people in communities contacted her entire life and said, please strategize, please help us figure out how we can keep this highway from coming through our neighborhood or save this historic neighborhood. And she was always writing, but she was also so, she had no ego, no vanity, but she was really, really generous and would give her time. She was just really kind of a hero. Amen? Yeah?
Was Jane Jacobs known and honored in this neighborhood before they moved to Toronto? Was she well known?
Well, that's an interesting question. She was, everyone in the community loved her and knew who she was. She was sort of a silver-tongued prophet of the people. The Voice called her a woman no woman had had more enemies at City Hall since Margaret Sanger. I mean, she was a hero in Greenwich Village. I don't think she was beloved among the status quo, among the planning and architectural community. Even though people who had fought her during the time she was fighting for the West Village later came around to her point of view. But I think it was later, by the time 2000 came, she came back for a big speech, and people from planners from all over the world came and honored her. So by then, she was well known, but I think not, except in the neighborhood, because everyone realized she was really good at building consensus. I mean, that was the other thing about these women. They were quite selfless. None of them liked the spotlight. They did it because they needed, when they spoke publicly, they did it because they needed to, but they were really good at organizing around an idea and building consensus and building community and not leaving people out. And so I think in the village, yeah, she was really good. I think people like Moses, and one of the things is the New York Times always covered every story about the village. They would interview Moses and his minions. And she realized that even though their side was picked up, it was always, sort of the footnote. So she realized you had to change the narrative. So she started feeding insider information to the Village Voice, which was this new, scrappy downtown local newspaper. And suddenly the story did change. The Times had to then not just cover it from the point of view of the developers and of Moses. Moses had 28 positions in New York City government that were all appointed. I mean, no one had, he had the purse strings on so many levels. So it was the fact that she prevailed and saved the West Village and saved Washington Square Park is just kind of a miracle, because he had so much power. And he was very savvy and very charming. So, yeah. I should also say this, the way I wrote this book is, I wanted to create for the reader the genesis of their ideas and the moments when they became who they were, the quirks in their character. So I've written it in a very novelistic way, even though I use their letters and diaries and things as their voices, but the only way I remember things is by attaching them to a story. So it's really 4 stories of these triumphant women at a time when, women were supposed to make coffee, not decisions. Yes, way back.
Hi, I'm sorry I came in late, so you might have covered any of this. There's just 3 things that kind of come to mind that are a little less, I'm a huge fan of both these women, but I remember reading that one of Jane Jacobs' first journalistic assignments, or at some point in the late 40s, she was actually able to write or be paid to write for some kind of front organization publication. That's one thing. Also about the Jane Jacobs housing over near, more, that it was disappointing in the end. They had all these cost problems. And then also, if you have anything to say, I read something about how Corbusier had a kind of more moderate 10-story design thing that just people didn't latch on to as much or something like that.
Yeah, and he designed some beautiful things and was a great thinker. It's true about, I can't speak too much to Corbusier, but it's true the housing that in the village that Jane was part of organizing, the jury is out on whether people are happy there. We actually have some friends who live there, and they like it well enough, but it's pretty cold, and it's not a high-rise, but it's not very, it doesn't have much texture, and I don't know what people think about it. I don't think it's very... Yeah,
interior I've been there and people seem happy, but they just had us really scrimp on anything that made it more warm in terms of exterior.
Detailing and things. And of course, one thing is Jane didn't talk about was the problem of gentrification, because it hadn't really begun. And that's the new scourge of cities, is that they're becoming so expensive and so difficult for young people to come and afford to live there. That what she would say is, when a neighborhood like Soho becomes monoculture, you should leave it and go to another neighborhood where you can, that's more vital, and that you can fix up buildings and it's still affordable, and that you can colonize other parts of the city, and that infill buildings should try to build in the same scale that exists there.
Well, just about West Village houses, often known as Jane Jacobs houses, you have to compare it to the towers that would have been there.
Yeah.
Right.
The houses created more, I'm sure you know this, more units of housing than the towers would have.
That's interesting.
Which is counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But there it is.
Yeah.
It created green spots that are at least visually accessible to the public.
And the community...
that has almost none.
Right, and the community was really involved in the planning and every aspect, so that was completely different. Yeah, the green space is really true.
And then, I mean, I actually know a lot of people who love living there, people who kill to live there, but, quite aside, they don't need to, but quite aside from that, you know, compared to things like the Richard Meyer buildings, I mean, we're talking about worn and
Right,
textured.
right,
Yeah.
right,
Nothing being built now with all the millions
right,
is worn and
right.
textured. It's all out of scale.
right. And the other thing about so many of those new, very, very fancy buildings is they're not owned by full-time residents. So they're dark most of the time, which Jane said, again, was the killer of cities, because people aren't coming and going at all hours of the night. People come for 2 weeks a year, and the rest of the time, most of the building is dark, which is really bad for cities. Yeah, I mean, it would be I'm sure that there are thinkers who are sort of trying to tackle those things now, but it'd be very interesting to get Jane back here to see what her solutions were. I'm sure she would say storefronts that were vacant for too long that the rents were too high, and that they should have, that those had to be rented out to, because there are always businesses who want them, it's just the landlords are want too much. So, yeah.
I think that by the early 70s, she must have had a more positive impact than City Hall. I'm an architect, and I used to work for the Urban Design Council in the Planning Commission, and we were asked to study the zoning resolution for the city at that time, 72, 73, and see if the element of quality could be introduced in the way the zoning was written at that time. So we were studying
To think in a different way.
amount of windows,
Yeah.
linear lines of buildings and
Yeah.
stuff, and the plazas around the building, like the Le Corbusier buildings and Sixth Avenue, Avenue Americas, living plazas, empty, and dangerous, and windy.
Right.
And something happened to the I left after that, but something must have happened to the zoning resolution, because then you ended up having the enclosures
Right.
on Madison Avenue around the buildings.
Yeah.
And
That's interesting. So.
and the developers were awarded with more floors if they
Right.
actually followed these
Right.
quality issues.
Right, that's interesting that maybe the city was moving in the right direction and the developers just had too much clout.
I can actually
Yeah,
answer that one.
yeah.
Because
That's really the case now. I mean, the question of if Jacobs is still relevant. I mean, Red Hook is under enormous pressure now because of global warming and because of rising seas. Developers are saying, look, we'll build a new causeway that will be higher than the rising waters if we can do this, this, and this, and it will be like Battery Park City many times over, and completely lose the neighborhood. Yeah.
People, Battery Park City is great compared to.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was new zoning resolution published in 1991. And the one you were looking at, in 72, was the last time there had been a real New York zoning resolution published was 62. Right?
61.
61.
So 60.
And the evidence
I'm a
of
master.
that plan for New York was the cathedral plan, where the tallest buildings would be at the center hallways of the borough, whatever borough it was, and step down toward the boundaries, so that you wouldn't be cutting light and air off
Right,
for anyone.
right.
And that was completely eliminated with the change in zoning that was done right after Battery Park City, when it was the new waterfront zoning, which I believe was published in 92.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I know about this because I fought it so hard.
Yeah,
And I have to tell you that urban plan, I was working with the West Village Committee, Jane Jacobs Committee,
yeah,
and
yeah. Yeah, I think she died in late, like 1998 or something. I mean, yeah.
but I mean, I'm
Yeah.
saying the committee was
Yeah.
in touch with the
Yeah,
And
yeah, she was still strategizing as part of, much later, yeah,
She didn't want to get too
Yeah,
involved, but,
yeah.
she certainly approved of what we were trying. Now I've lost the thread there.
cathedral, the
The
zoning.
waterfronts, all right, so
Oh,
let's
waterfront.
talk about the urban planning department, New York City Department of Planning. Hysterical, they referred to us and everyone allied with us as the West Village crazies. In fact, hundreds of points, people in hundreds of points, same fight. All over the city, Jersey City, you've seen what's happened on the Jersey City, same fight.
Yeah,
We've almost totally lost
yeah,
this fight.
yeah, yeah.
The waterfront was completely rezoned for towers with plazas.
Yeah, in exchange.
That is how it was done.
Yeah.
Go.
61 was the, that's where you get the new zoning that allows for inclusionary zoning. And that was based actually off of the Seagram's building design, because you had Mies van der Rohe, who came in, introduced this international style building that did allow for these new plazas with light and air. So the zoning resolution was changed to include this to add more public space and public benefit, but with the inclusion of, like, you know, you'll get a more higher floor area ratio if you include these plazas. Unfortunately, then you had the work of William H. White, who, with his social life of small urban spaces, who observed these plazas and observed the way that they were designed, and, you know, you had these developers, yes, putting in these plazas, but they were designing them to dissuade people from using the space.
Or put in a fancy restaurant
Yeah.
instead of
So-
a place where kids could play.
Yeah, so that's why 70, I think it's 73 or 75, it was amended to really take into consideration, like, yes, you can have this inclusionary zoning, but you also need to not have a restrictive design covenants within it.
And open spaces have gotten better. I mean, now the fact that there are food trucks, there's little skating rinks, I mean, at least they're allowed to be used for the people. Yeah, liveliness, that's it. If they're too dull and they're too alienating and they're too windy. I was walking in Lincoln Center to get tickets in the middle of the winter, and I thought, wow, this is like crossing the Great Prairie. It's really windswept and grim, and it's better than it used to be.
I have a question about Jane's other book, The Economy of Cities. It's not as popular at all.
I know.
Can you explain why? I remember reading it after I read Death and Life, but I don't recall it ever having the kind of popularity.
Yeah, it didn't. I don't know. It's a really interesting book. And maybe that's why in Japan she's known as an economist. So maybe in other places. No, I think that always was disappointing to her, that The Death and Life of Great American Cities remained a classic, but her other books were you know, not taken up. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious, Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses were such powerful personalities. How many times did they publicly debate each other?
No,
they never met?
No, and in the Power Broker, evidently, the whole section about Jacobs was taken out because Caro's book was so long, it was another 200 pages. Yeah. And Jane talks about when she finally read it and when she learned how corrupt, I mean, how dictatorial and she was even shocked, and she had, you know, he was never her favorite person. But I don't think they had many encounters. But he knew who she was because she was always leading the charge.
Well, on TV and, you know, magazines, whatever, he was very clear about how he felt about
Yeah.
her.
Yeah.
I thought,
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
No, and it's incredible she held her ground. That was the interesting thing about all of these women. They were so certain about what they believed, and they had a certain kind of moral clarity, and they had nothing to lose. They had no power, so they just kept fighting, and did it in very, you know, Jacobs was so brilliant at strategizing, and another one of the protests she led against the Lower Manhattan Expressway, she dressed all these grandmothers and little kids in gas masks to dramatize the soot and the pollution, and that was an incredible photo op to see all these people, little people in gas masks, you know, and it went viral before the internet. One wonders what the internet would have done for Jacob. She probably would have been very savvy. Well, thank you all for coming.